Okay, so I think we can start the second part of this session. So the first speaker will be Tarryn Balsdon from Glasgow University, who will show us our work on perceptual decision-making in human with EEG studies.
Thank you. You can hear me, right? Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. And I'm excited to show you this new work that I've been doing as part of my postdoc with Marius Viliastidis in Glasgow. But I wanted to motivate this work with some of my previous work with Pascal Mamassian and Valentin Viard. And I realized yesterday I may have been a little bit overconfident with how much I could put in this presentation. But yeah, we'll see how we go. So we started this project with this broad question of how do we feel confident that we've made a correct perceptual decision? And we're looking at this from a computational perspective. So how do we compute confidence? And I use this sort of box diagram here. We can think of, we present a physical stimulus and there's some perceptual evidence that's noisy and it's accumulated over time to let you make a perceptual decision and enter your perceptual response. We can slot confidence in as evaluating the evidence that you use to make your perceptual decision, which allows you to make a confidence response. For example, a rating on a scale of 1 to 4 of how confident you are you're correct. And looking at things like this, it looks like confidence is just a different readout of the same information used to make your perceptual decision. But we have reasons to think that's not the case. There's some evidence that there's independent noise affecting the confidence evaluation that wasn't affecting the perceptual decision. There's some evidence that the magnitude of this noise might be correlated across tasks. So perhaps there's some metacognitive system that's used to evaluate confidence for perceptual decisions, but also memory decisions and so on and so forth. And finally, there's some evidence that confidence could use additional information that wasn't used in the perceptual decision. For example, information that comes up after you've already committed to your perceptual decision. And looking at it like this, it looks like there is actually something that's quite different about making a confidence decision from making a perceptual decision. The problem is it's very difficult to tease these two things apart because confidence is very much relying on the same evidence you use to make your perceptual decision. So that's what we were trying to do, try and tease apart confidence and perception. And oops, okay, here we go. What I'm going to show you today is some more evidence for this additional evidence used for confidence that allows us to separate out these processes for confidence from those for perception. And then we're going to argue for another arrow here. We're going to make things more complicated, suggesting that confidence might have some control over perceptual decision processes. And then things are going to get wild with this new work. I'm going to suggest that this is actually the main route by which this processing happens. Okay, here we go. So we need to use a task where we can sort of slow down and control perceptual processes. And we're going to try and encourage what I call premature perceptual decisions. So in this task, observers are presented on a single trial with a sequence of these oriented Gabor patches. And the orientations are drawn from one of 2 circular Gaussian distributions. The observer has to decide which distribution they're drawn from. But importantly, the distributions are overlapping. So the observer has to use multiple stimuli to make their decision and essentially accumulate evidence over consecutive samples. And in this free task, the sequence continues until the observer enters their response. And this is their performance, about 80% correct. And then we take the same sequences of evidence shown to observers in the free task, and we replay them in the replay task. But we use a manipulation. So in this task, we're replaying the same sequences again. The observer is still deciding whether they're blue or orange distribution, but they have to wait until the sequence finishes before they enter their response. And we use 3 different conditions. In the less condition, we show them 2 fewer than the number of stimuli that they chose to respond to on that same sequence in the free task. In the same condition, we show them the same number. And in the more condition, we showed them 4 more than the number of stimuli they chose to respond to on that same sequence in the free task. What you can see is that showing them just 2 fewer stimuli severely limits their performance, but showing them an additional 4 stimuli doesn't give them much benefit. This is one data set. We ran the same set of tasks in another experiment with new observers. And we use a computational model to describe behavior. So this model, it has noisy samples of perceptual evidence that are accumulated over time with some leak that biases people's decisions towards the more recent evidence. And importantly, to describe this pattern of behavior, we had to implement in our model what we call a covert bound. So this bound is suggesting that observers might be committing to their decisions before the end of the sequence. That's the fit of the model. So essentially, observers might be committing to their decisions around here and ignoring these additional stimuli for the sake of their perceptual decision. And we see evidence for this in EEG too. So we can use the lateralized beta power over motor cortex to train a classifier in the free task to tell us what button observers are pressing. And then we take this classifier trained in the free task and we apply it over time in the replay task. So in the same condition, we see this nice symmetry where around the time of the response, the classifier trained around the time of the response in the free task is able to tell us what button observers are pressing in the replay task. But in the more condition, we get this asymmetry where this here is telling us that the activity around the time of the response in the free task is able to tell us what button observers will press 2 seconds before they actually press that button, because observers are already planning what button they're going to press before the end of the sequence. So what about confidence? We asked observers for a confidence rating in the replay task. And it's on a scale of 1 to 4 of how confident you are, you're correct. And you can see as confidence increases, so does proportion correct in the perceptual decision. And we can also take this measure of model evidence, which is the evidence presented from the actual stimuli that I showed observers, which also tends to increase, which is in line with what I said before, that the confidence decisions are using the underlying evidence presented to the observer. And we also find evidence for independent noise affecting the confidence decision and a separate leak. But most importantly here, what we see is no evidence for this covert bound. So it appears that observers, although they're committing to their perceptual decision here and ignoring these additional stimuli, they're still using them to make their confidence decision. And what this means is that we have a situation, oh, that's the model fit. We have a situation where we think these perceptual decision processes are complete, but the confidence processes are still ongoing, meaning that we could isolate them on the neural level. So to do this, we're going to look at neural activity related to this evidence accumulation. So as the observers presented with these stimuli, they should be accumulating evidence from each sample. The evidence is related to the particular orientation. And we can look at the neural activity locked to stimulus onset and compare the amplitude of the EEG signals to the accumulated evidence, and use the relationship to predict the accumulated evidence on held out data, which gives us a measure of the precision of this representation of accumulated evidence from the EEG. So this is the precision. You can see it's quite extended in time and it's relying on both frontal and occipital electrodes. Now, this is telling us that the information is present, but not how it's being used. Another thing you might notice is that the precision isn't that great. A lot of this is because of measurement noise, but some of it's also because of what we call inference noise. To do this analysis, I used the actual evidence presented to the observer, so the physical orientations, but we know that the human observer has a noisy and leaky representation of this. So we reasoned that if what's in the observer's mind is more different from ideal, then what is in the EEG should also be more different from ideal, so long as what's in the EEG is actually representing information important for behavior. So we look across time and electrode location at where the errors in the EEG signal are predicting errors in observers' confidence responses. And we get these late clusters over both occipital and frontal electrodes. We can also look at what happens before the observer commits to their covert decision or after. And what we find, so after they've completed their perceptual processes. What we find is the representation from this cluster related to confidence increases after the observer commits to their perceptual decision. If we do the same thing to predict observers' perceptual decisions, we find an earlier occipital cluster, and the representation here decreases in precision after commitment to the perceptual decision. So we get this really nice association where we see this confidence that's ongoing throughout decision-making and is separable from those earlier processes related to the perceptual decision. So we think this is a separable neural representation of confidence during perceptual decision-making. Now, what's a bit curious about this is why is it ongoing during decision-making? To me, it would seem more efficient to wait until you've accumulated all the evidence for your decision and then evaluate it at the confidence level, unless there was some use for confidence online. And that's why we propose that there could be some confidence control. And we see some evidence for this using a similar task. So here the observers are presented with these orientations again until they enter their response. But this time they have to enter their response as soon as they think they've reached a certain accuracy target. And these accuracy targets were completed in separate blocks. Now, what we think observers should do, if we look at how this evidence might accumulate over time, is they should increase this bound at which they make their decision to increase their accuracy. And this appears to be what observers are doing. So observers look at more samples of evidence when trying to reach higher accuracy targets. But they're not doing so efficiently. So here you can see that observers are actually overperforming in the 70% correct condition and underperforming when trying to reach 85 and 90%. And we can use our computational model to calculate how well observers are actually moderating their bounds to meet these different accuracy targets. And we call this their decision efficiency. And I'm going to compare it to their confidence efficiency, which is how well their confidence is being used to discriminate their underlying perceptual decision performance, which was measured on a separate task on a separate day. And what we see is this nice, strong correspondence between the two. So although this is just a correlation, it suggests that perhaps we could be using confidence online to control when we're committing to our decisions. Okay, so this is maybe something sounding a bit strange now, but it's not just us. There's more recent evidence, especially looking at value decision-making with value, that's implementing this idea of confidence control. And perhaps it could be related also to earlier work, looking at value and how that might influence the shape of the decision bound over time. But it still begs the question of why over 80 years of studying perceptual confidence, we haven't found much evidence for confidence control before. And what I'd like to suggest is that we haven't really been putting people in the kind of situation where this influence of confidence would be most pronounced. So that's why we go to these dynamic sensory environments. And so in a dynamic sensory environment, the quality of the sensory evidence can change over time. And you would benefit from using your confidence to upweight the influence of high quality sensory evidence or downweight the influence of low quality sensory evidence. So here we're going to use a stimulus in which we can manipulate the quality of the sensory evidence within the time frame of a single decision. So it's a variant of the random dot motion stimulus, where on each frame, the dot directions are sampled from a circular Gaussian distribution. So they would most likely be going in this direction, but with some variability. And the observer has to decide if they're going more leftward or rightward or vertical. And we can change, that would give some strong evidence. We can change the properties of the generating distribution, so increase the variance and decrease the mean away from vertical to give low quality sensory evidence. And importantly, we can swiftly and smoothly transition between these distributions frame by frame, so as to give observers decreasing sensory evidence or increasing sensory evidence. And just because I like to make things extra complicated, we can do this with the mean or the variance, and we can also create a mid-level, and we could create stable mid-levels by changing the mean and the variance in opposite directions. This is an example of what the stimulus looks like. So you can see that there's more variability at the beginning, and then they become less variable as they go along. This is what people do. So you can see here, observers are making fast, accurate responses to the high quality, early high quality sensory evidence, but they're slowing down when encountering low quality sensory evidence. And importantly, classic evidence accumulation model dramatically fails to capture this pattern of behavior. And so observers it's struggling because observers are both fast and accurate and also slow. And this is because I've intermixed all these trials. So the human observer has no way of knowing what information is going to be presented next and how it's going to change. And so they can't use this traditional method of varying the bound to try and speed up or slow down. Let's have a look at confidence. So despite these quite dramatic changes across conditions in an observer's proportion correct and reaction times, their confidence is actually quite stable. And this is true within observers as well. And it's not because confidence is bad. If I show you this is the mean confidence on incorrect decisions, it's substantially lower. But this is actually something that we might expect if observers were using their confidence to know when to commit to their decisions. And here I can show you when I implement this confidence control in our model, it dramatically improves the fit to behavior. So this confidence control is not just about adding additional parameters. I have added one parameter. It's actually about changing the underlying model framework to a framework of double integration. So in the classic model, there's a single integration process where evidence accumulates over time until you reach a bound that dictates the decision. Here we're proposing a double integration framework where this forms the primary accumulator, which remains unbounded. The evidence from the primary accumulator is then broadcast to a secondary accumulator, which we're going to call the motor accumulator. And the motor accumulator reintegrates the already integrated evidence. And it does so with some leak. This double integration process acts as a kind of smoothing filter, which increases the signal to noise ratio. And it does this in accordance with this leak parameter. So with high leak, the secondary accumulator appears similar to the primary accumulator. But as you decrease the leak, you increase the temporal smoothing and you slow down the rate at which the evidence meets the decision bound. We like this model for many reasons, but I thought I would just note at this point as well that the model's nice in we're hoping to link it to the more active role of motor processes in decision making. But for now, what we've done here is we've used online measures of confidence based on the primary accumulator to moderate this leak. So when observers have high confidence, that leak increases and their evidence speeds towards the bound. But when they have low confidence, you're increasing the temporal smoothing and trying to increase the signal to noise ratio in your own internal processing. We can put this into my old box diagram. Here's the primary accumulator and the motor accumulator, and things are actually going this way now. And actually, to explain confidence, we can get rid of this stuff because there's already more noise in the primary accumulator and a different temporal profile. And what I can do is I can take the model that I fit to our human observers' behavior, just their choices and response times. I can simulate the evidence that predicts their responses on each trial. And I can take the final state of the primary accumulator and use that to predict their confidence. And here you can see that this is working quite well at showing how confidence is changing over fast and slow decisions and how it changes over correct and incorrect decisions. We can also use these evidence traces to try and look at EEG signatures of this double integration. Now, you might be thinking that actually these traces look quite similar. So how are you going to do this? But they're not too similar. If we look at the derivative, there's a difference in the rate at which this evidence is accumulating over time. Oh, thank you. I have been speaking fast. Sorry. Where was I? Right. So we're going to use these temporal dynamics from the model simulated evidence and decode it with the EEG to try and find sources. And where am I? It's been a long time. Right, so I wanted to remind you at this point that the model only knows about numbers. I haven't told it that I've been calling this the motor accumulator, and I haven't told the model that observers are only responding with their right hand. And yet when I try and trace these sources back, this is what I see. So this primary evidence accumulation signal looks like what we normally see with evidence accumulation, this sort of CPP. And the motor one is right over that contralateral motor cortex. What I can also do is look at observers' behavioral confidence responses and use another decoding analysis to decode their confidence after their decision. And we get this nice topography here. And then what I can do is I can use this as a sort of spatial filter and slide it over time to try and predict confidence during decision-making. And I can relate this signatures of online confidence during decision-making to the online signatures of motor accumulation. What our model is suggesting is that these online signatures of confidence are driving changes in the leak. So with higher confidence, you get increases in the leak, and with lower confidence, less leak. So the confidence signal should be related to the change in the motor accumulator. And we find this to be the case. But more than this, we can relate this back to behavior. So here's the proportion correct and the median response times. And we can look at the trial by trial correlation between these online signals. And when we see a weaker correlation compared to a stronger correlation, you see that a stronger correlation in the confidence signal. So when that confidence signal is driving more closely the changes in the motor accumulator, we get faster, more accurate decisions. This is within observers, within conditions. Okay, so this suggests that confidence control is increasing behavioral efficiency. And yes, so this is my summary, I suppose. Based on this, it's very new data. I want to suggest that perhaps this is the main route by which we're making our decisions. And I look forward to your critical feedback. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. Could you maybe a little bit explain why you would want to base your decisions on double integration rather than the regular integration?
Yeah, so the double integration is nice in smoothing out temporally independent noise. So if you have a system that has internal noise, especially affecting it, you can try and smooth this out with the double integration process. And I suppose because this confidence signal should be looking at the quality of the internal processes. If we're using our confidence to do that, to moderate how much smoothing we need, that should be improving your decision-making.
Thank you for it was very clear and it was a great, interesting talk.
Thanks.
Just one question about, so I like the idea of confidence control, of course, but did you try to manipulate, for example, the prior confidence people have before they actually see the evidence, the reward at stake for making a correct answer, or other kinds of factors like this to see whether that changes the way people control their decisions, whether that changes the final confidence that they report, etc. So did you try to find the determinants of confidence control, and did you have already results on this?
I don't have results on it yet, but all of these things are things that we want to look at. I think in this data, the prior confidence, perhaps we can look at things like a sequential dependency, and definitely the pre-stimulus EEG signatures. For reward, we want to do a project where we're going to try to orthogonalize reward and confidence, and to try and disentangle these two. We're thinking of confidence as sort of like an internal intrinsic value signal in a way. There's something that's rewarding about feeling confident that you're correct. And so if we try and disentangle an external reward from an intrinsic confidence, how is that going to mess with this situation, basically? Yeah.
Yeah. So if I can prolong Jean's question and to make the link with the Jean's model, do you have any evidence in your data that confidence control is effortful?
I can't think of something that I've looked at currently, but I definitely think that it is. Yeah. I think another thing that we want to do is put people in situations where there's more or less time pressure. And when there's more time pressure, we should see a weaker confidence control because there's this rush to get to the decision. But with less time pressure, you can put in the effort. Perhaps also using reward and external motivational factors can influence that as well. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. Just one question. In your classic model, have you tried any models with primacy biased term in your models? Yeah.
No, I've just been using the traditional
Yeah, because
DDM.
in this paradigm, I would expect to see this primacy effect. And also in your behavior data.
Yeah. Yeah. So I suppose, I mean, one thing about the double integration framework with the confidence leak is you do end up with a bit of primacy. When you're starting off with better quality evidence, you really quickly zoom up. Whereas with the low quality evidence, that lower leak drags things out much longer. Yeah, we could try adding primacy into the traditional DDM and see how that affects things.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, if there is no more question, I think we could switch to the next last speaker. Thank you.